Hey guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys are all doing well this week and that you've had a good week. I hope if you celebrated Thanksgiving that you enjoyed it and everything went well for you. Unfortunately for me, it did not go so well. As you guys can clearly see, I'm almost a week behind. I have been having technical difficulties like you wouldn't believe this week. Hopefully these will come out, guys, and I can still save one more story for the end of the month. I have no idea what happened this week. Um, if you guys are new to this channel, like I said, my name is Crystal and I do Canadian true crime or true crime with a Canadian twist from time to time. I also do international crimes, ones recommended to me, ones that interest me, or ones that show differences in the judicial systems, guys, just so that you can have a clearer understanding of how it works around the world. It's different everywhere. Next week's case will probably highlight that for sure, guys. Hopefully, as long as everything gets uploaded. So hopefully, guys, that sounds like something that you guys want to watch. Hopefully you'll like these videos. Hopefully you'll subscribe if you haven't already. Share if you want to, and leave me some comments. You guys know I always say this because this is the wrap up, particularly about this case that we have been talking about for the past, well, this will be the third week. Fred and Rose West. Oh God, guys, I'm tired. Are you tired? Whew, it's a lot, isn't it? Oh, and if you guys are returning subscribers, you guys already know how much I love you and how thankful I am that you guys choose to watch my videos. It makes me really, really happy that you guys choose to do that. Without you guys, I wouldn't be here. If you guys do want to leave some comments, though, you guys already know the world is already filled with so much hate, so please do not leave any hate. We're just here to talk about things. Like I've always said, my theories and your theories might be two different things, and I'd love to hear other people's opinions on stuff, because sometimes I haven't thought about that. So hopefully this week will go a lot better than last week. These videos are for educational or entertainment purposes only. Y'all know how YouTube works. So we're gonna not do too much of a recap, guys. At this point in time, Fred and Rose now live at 25 Cromwell Street. They have at least 9 bodies between them, several of which are already buried underneath the house. We know that Anne McFall, Rena, and Charmaine are buried closer to Much Markle, the two women, and Charmaine herself is at 25 Midland Road where they used to live. We've talked about some of the abuses that the kids have suffered, so trigger warning, guys, I did put it out for the other ones too. This case is disturbing. It's going to get even more so these may not be the videos to watch if you are triggered by things like child abuse, like torture, things of that nature, because that's what we talk about when we talk about Fred and Rose West. But we're winding down now, guys. We are really winding down. So like we had said before, Fred and Rose had lodgers, right? And Rose didn't really care for them, but at various points in time, they would stop lodging for a little while and then they'd invite more people in, particularly if money was getting tighter, right? Yes, Fred worked a lot. He had a lot of different jobs. Yes, Rose was prostituting, but they didn't really pull in that much money. Fred was basically illiterate, guys, so, you know, the tougher jobs he probably couldn't get to. So in 1977, Fred had decided to take in more lodgers. These ones would be strictly female. They had learned their lesson from the male ones. You guys know, with all the drug busts and everything. So at this point in time, they're inviting women in. And this is how 17-year-old Shirley Robinson came to be at 25 Cromwell Street. And actually, Shirley was there for quite a while, much longer than most of the other lodgers or people that Fred and Rose had picked up. So at this point in time, Rose is pregnant again. This would be with Stephen. And, this would be with Tara, I believe. I believe Stephen is already born at this point in time. It is 1977. So at this point in time, they needed to add on to the house. You guys already know that in the 20 plus years that Fred and Rose actually lived at this place, Fred was constantly building. He was constantly building onto this house. So he built another room for the new baby, ostensibly. Anna's boyfriend was also living with the family as well. Fred had this thing where he'd invite the boyfriends to stay with them. probably because he wanted to hear his daughter's sex lives, to be honest, and he'd always make sure that they knew it was okay for that to happen. On December 6th of 1977, Rose's daughter Tara was born. She is a mixed race. They said mixed race, guys. I'm sorry. Biracial baby. I hope I'm getting this right. She was fathered by one of Rose's clients. This never bothered Fred. He would give the baby his last name, everything like that. In fact, he embraced this. He and Rose called their biracial children their love children. Fred had this weird philosophy, guys. I may have touched on it in the last video, where he believed that one man and one woman shouldn't have too many kids together. Okay, this is a really strange theory, but he thought if one man fathered a lot of kids by one woman, then the likelihood of a genetic abnormality would be increased. I don't know why he thought that. He just thought that. He's got a lot of strange thoughts. So he was fully embracing Rose having kids with other men. It didn't seem to matter to him. Now, they also had this other habit, and I didn't discuss it before, where Fred would take Rose's semen-stained underwear from when she was with her clients and other men, because remember, some paid, some didn't, and keep them in a jar, okay? And when the jar got too full, he'd burn them and keep the ashes in another, kind of like I almost want to say like a candy dish, but smaller. You guys know, one of those ornate little, almost like a jewelry box. He would keep the ashes in there and glue the lids on shut. Now, I know the kids found this out one time and they had pried a lid off one, and there was definitely ashes in it. Rose got embarrassed and told them, this is one of the few times she was ever embarrassed about it, and told them it was the underwear. I'm also wondering, though, if some of those ashes weren't the missing bones of the girls. Remember, Fred loves to take away some of the bones, ankle bones, wrist bones, could be part of a rib cage. He's taken a shoulder bone before. I think part of a chest bone. We didn't go into every single detail about that. Finger bones, toe bones. He'd always take something away from him. And some of the skeletons were only found with like 70 bones, guys. So in some of the cases, he did take a lot. I'm wondering if he didn't somehow burn them down. I know it takes an incredible amount of heat. I think it's 3,000 plus degrees in order to burn human bone to ash. But a part of me, it's just a small part, because remember, they never found any of these trophies. I'm wondering if he didn't do something like that in order to keep them around, but not have anybody wonder about it. He could have mixed in it. Within 2 months of Tara's birth, Rose was pregnant again, guys. This would be Fred's baby. Well, maybe. There's controversy about that too. So Shirley Robinson actually turned 18 in October of 1977. She had been living with Fred and Rose for some time at this point in time, and she had a sexual relationship with both of them. She seemed to have favored Rose to Fred, even though Rose was way more aggressive sexually. I'm not quite sure what the reasoning was. She seemed to have. But nevertheless, she allowed herself to become pregnant with Fred's child. So both she and Rose are pregnant at the same point in time. And you know what Rose does when she has competition. Now, Shirley had the same problems with life that most of the other victims had to. Her parents had split up when she was really young. They didn't live in the area that she lived in. She had no one in the direct vicinity of 25 Cromwell Street. Her parents lived away. And she, like many of the other kids that are involved in the story, young women that are involved in the story, ended up in foster care. So I'm sure some part of her must have thought of this as a family dynamic, guys, and that she was happy to be there in some ways. So of course we know this can't happen. Rose is probably very upset that Shirley is pregnant. In fact, according to according to the book that we've been taking information from, which is Happy Life Murderers, according to that, Fred was flaunting his relationship with Shirley to Rose, claiming that, oh, this can be the next Mrs. West. And of course, you know, Rose is going to get really volatile about that. I'm wondering if he didn't do that to Rena, though, too, about Rose. You know what I mean? It just seems to be part of his nature. But according to that, they were flaunting it. At one point in time, someone showed up to the house, one of the visitors, and he introduced Rose as his wife and Shirley as his girlfriend, and confirmed that they were both pregnant with his children. So anyway, like we know, this couldn't happen. Now, she was 8.5 months old, 8.5 months pregnant, sorry, when she disappeared, guys. This would be around May 9th of 1978. So like I said, she lived there for quite some time. This would be around May 9th. She was last seen by a friend who was also a lodger at Cromwell Street. They had talked for a little bit, and she said that Shirley seemed depressed, that she seemed really despondent, that she was tired, and that she admitted to being afraid of both Fred and Rose in this last period. Fred and Rose then told the lodger when Shirley disappeared that Shirley had gone to Germany. Rose was actually seen packing up her things, and Fred was seen throwing them out. And that's what they did with a lot of the victims that lived in the household. Linda Go, remember, Rose took some of her things. That's what they would do. So by June of 1978, the extension was finished for Rose's new baby, for the babies, I should say. This is where Fred buried Shirley's body. Of course, she was decapitated. The fetus was removed, and there are some reports that claim it was actually Rose that did that. I can't say for sure what happened. Obviously, we don't know. But once again, there were finger and toe bones missing as well. Now, in this case, no restraints were actually found with Shirley, so it's possible he killed her without sexually torturing her, or it's possible Rose did, or they both did together. No restraints were found in this case, but she was definitely missing the kneecap bone, one of her kneecaps, and her finger and toe bones. So pretty much Fred's normal MO. One night in 1978, Heather, May, and Stephen devised a plan to escape. This is according to Stephen, but you have to take it with a grain of salt, guys, because Stephen was like Fred and was known to tell stories. He was known to be a bullshitter, just like Fred. They didn't want to be in the house anymore. Of course, obviously the girls, especially Heather, are getting sexually attacked by their father. They're being abused horribly by their mother. They know what Anna Marie had gone through. All of this stuff is happening to them. And they decided that they wanted out. They also didn't like the endless chores. They basically had to do chores all the time. And when Rose beat you, she beat you bloody. You guys know that. So obviously they wanted to escape. What is known for sure is that at this point in time, the kids were moved from the cellar. Remember, they had to sleep on the bodies. They didn't know, but they were sleeping on a graveyard. They were moved up from the cellar to the bedroom beside Fred and Rose, so that Fred and Rose could watch them and hear them more, let's just say. Rose's clients had also taken to abusing the girls at this point in time too. And Fred, like I said, was always watching them, groping them, trying to have his way with them. Remember, he believed it was a father's right to do this. He would be very aggressive if they turned him down, and Heather was the one that particularly fought against him. He was raping them as well. May claims she doesn't remember being raped by her father, but Stephen said that for sure he knows it happened because he was living in the same area as the girls. But it was especially Heather that would put up a resistance and a fight against her father. And of course, this made Fred really, really mad. We know that Fred isn't physically abusive to his children very often. It actually takes Fred quite a bit to snap. But he was known to strike out at the kids if he was pushed too far. And he would strike out at Heather. He would also accuse them of being lesbians or ask them if they were lesbians if they fended off his advances. Heather in particular seemed to suffer from what Fred and Rose did. She seemed to suffer more than the other kids. She was sullen. She was angry. She was depressed. She would bite her fingernails down to the quick. She was like Rose. She developed Rose's habit of rocking all the time and of staring off into space. I don't know if I told you guys this before, but a lot of people said that about Rose, that she would just stare into space. Now we know that it's more than likely that Rose had some brain trauma due to the fact that her mother had received ECT therapy, electroconvulsive therapy when she was pregnant with Rose. So that could have been part of the reason, but she was known just to stare off into space. She was disassociating, guys. You guys know, especially with childhood trauma, particularly of a sexual nature, a child will learn, their brain will learn to disassociate, and they're no longer in that space. They're somewhere else. And Heather would do this quite often. She wanted nothing more than to get away and not live with other people, guys. She just wanted to live by herself. She hated men at this point in time. She didn't trust a lot of people. She just did not want to be around people. She wanted to live as a hermit in the Forest of Dean. So Rose became pregnant again in 1979. She had given birth to her daughter Louise in 1978, I believe towards the end. Sorry, I didn't mark down the date of Tara's birth. Louise's birth. There is some confusion about Tara and Louise. Some books will say that Louise was born before Tara. I did have a book, guys, that, if you just give me 1 second, that actually had a timeline in it. Sorry, guys, sorry. So she was born in 1978. This would be Louise. Louise was not biracial. She was white. Most reports say that she was Fred's daughter, but there is some question. She may not have been Fred's daughter. She may have been fathered by another client. I am not 100% certain on that, guys. Sorry, I could not find a definitive answer. Some books say that it is, some books say that it isn't. And I actually did just order another book on it. It's called Fred and Rose, guys, and it's also a definitive account of what happened at Cromwell Street. It differs somewhat from Happy Like Murderers. There's enough of a storyline where they connect together, but there are some differences in it. So it's up to you to decide which one you want to go with. But like I said, once again, Rose is pregnant. This is the 5th time she's been pregnant, guys, and she is 25 years old. I just want to remind you of that. So in 1979, a girl named Allison Chambers, who lived at a home for abused and neglected children, disappeared. Okay. This would, it's like abused, troubled, neglected children, kind of like a group home setting almost. She was living in that, and she knew Fred from that. Fred was known to have done work at this place before, so she would have known Fred from there. Like many of the others, she was from a broken home, and she was actually bullied a lot at the group home, the area that she was living in. So it was kind of miserable for her there too. She would often run away. She was very thin, and she liked to dress very professionally, guys. She was very well put together when she dressed up all the time. Actually, that's what people saw her in, almost like in a business suit. And she was 17 years old. Fred and Rose, however she got involved with them totally, promised her that she was almost 17 at this point in time, that when she turned 17, she could come and live on their farm. Which they obviously didn't have, and write poetry and ride horses. Of course, for a girl that comes from a broken home, that's being bullied in the group home, foster home situation that she's living in, this sounds like a dream. Of course, Allison Chambers readily agreed to it. She was, not much is known about the exact date she disappeared or things of that nature, guys, but she was found, of course, February 28th, 1994, under the backyard, much like Heather, at 25 Cromwell Street. Hers would be the 3rd leg bone, the 3rd thigh bone that they found, which indicated that there had to have been more bodies there. A belt was actually strapped. Okay, so this is what I'm gathering. A belt was strapped under her chin, and then locked over her head, if you will, and over the top of her head. And then a coat belt was actually wrapped around her jaws so that she couldn't speak or anything else of that nature. And they, of course, were found in the grave with her. She was decapitated, dismembered, missing finger and toe bones like most of the other ones. And the area she had been buried in was actually once used as a paddling pool for the kids. They had dug it out or whatever. Stephen remembers helping dig it out. I think some of the other children might too. They remembered that it wasn't lined or anything. It wasn't like that. It was almost like just a hole. And the kids remember one day they were swimming in it. The next day it was concreted over. And that's because, of course, he had buried Allison Chambers there. Another thing to note about Fred, guys, that I didn't tell you before is that he always wore a very sharp knife on his belt. Always. Ostensibly it was for work, almost like a felt cutting knife, you know what I mean? Ostensibly it was to help him at work in his repairs, like the repair jobs that he did, but it was also very useful for when he had to dismember bodies. And at this point in time, Fred's pretty good at dismembering a body. Now, Anna was almost 15 in 1979 when Fred made her pregnant. Yup, you heard me. Fred made her pregnant at the same time as her stepmother. This was actually an ectopic pregnancy, so of course she had to be taken to a hospital and have an abortion because it would have ruptured, right? As soon as she got back from the hospital, Rose beat the crap out of her. There was no way around it. At this point in time, though, Anna was suffering quite a bit. She herself had turned into a bully. She would often bully kids at school. She could do it to her own brothers and sisters too. Not physically, I don't think with her brothers and sisters, but at school she would physically bully people. She was very belligerent like that. Almost like a touch of Rose's anger was in her. Even though Rose wasn't her mother, she did become a bully. And she was arrested at this point in time for actually stabbing a girl. The girl didn't die or anything, but she did stab a girl. Fred and Anna had a huge fight after this, and Anna left the house. So at 15 years old, she's finally out on her own and free from 25 Cromwell Street, but it didn't make life any better for her. Like anybody who left 25 Cromwell Street that had a room there, the room was stripped. All evidence and mementos of the fact that Anna had once lived there were gotten rid of. It was like she never existed in the house. She was not allowed to speak to the other kids on her own. Fred and Rose had to always be present. Like she didn't know the secrets that Fred and Rose wanted the other kids to keep, though. They did that. If one of the kids left the house, they weren't to talk to the other children, and they could only come and visit at set points in time. That's just the way it was, to keep it even more claustrophobic inside. She was, at that point in time, ostensibly outed from the family fold at that point in time. So she finally understood that her family wasn't normal, that fathers and daughters didn't usually have relations with each other, that mothers, stepmothers, and daughters didn't, that getting beaten every day wasn't a thing, that the torturous rapes, that's not how people loved each other. But yet at the same point in time, because of everything that had been done to her, she was kind of like Rose, conditioned to be like her, thinking that sex was a way to make other people happy so they wouldn't do something to you, or so that they would do something for you, and that sex was equated with love or warm feelings. If that person wants to have sex with you, then obviously they must have feelings towards you. So she became quite promiscuous. It wasn't her fault. That's all she knew from life. But she got herself into some dangerous situations. Eventually, like Rose before her, like her actual mother, Rena, she did have to turn to some prostitution. She wasn't like out there every night, but she did have to sleep with some people in order to support herself and survive. It was the only thing she knew. Plus, she's only 15 years old. She knew that eventually she'd had to do that. Now, Rose's son, Barry, Rose and Fred's son, definitely his son, guys. So Barry, their son, was born in 1980. It was in June of 1980. And Rose found that she was pregnant almost immediately afterwards. She actually did something that she had never done before, and she went in and had an abortion. At that point in time, I guess she just couldn't handle it. But it didn't stop her from becoming pregnant again. And she gave birth to another daughter named Rosemary Jr. in 1983, or sorry, in 1982. And then her final daughter, Lucy Anna, was born in 1983. Lucy Anna and Rosemary Jr. were also biracial children. There is some talk that their father could have been the same as Tara's, or that one of them and Tara may have had the same father, but they were definitely fathered by clients. At that point in time in 1983, Rose had decided she'd had enough children. There were 8 of them. I think she'd been pregnant at least 7 times. I think they count Anna Marie in with that. So at that point in time, she just decided she'd had enough, and she went in for a tubal ligation. So Rose grew at this point in time increasingly more violent towards Stephen. For some reason, she just didn't like him. And this is evidenced throughout the rest of his life. One point in time, one of the kids broke into Rose's special room, stole some of the pornographic magazines, and brought them to school. She thought it was Stephen, so she ordered him to come home, stripped him naked. It always had to be naked. Tied him down to the bathroom floor. It was in the bathroom that she beat him, and just beat him bloody and raw. Like, he had no idea what he'd done. He was trying to tell her he hadn't done it, and then, Rose takes the belt with the buckle end to hit you with. She just beat him like you wouldn't believe. After she was done, she made him go back to school. The school then called and told them it was actually Heather that had stolen the pornography. And instead of apologizing to Stephen, she just laughed and said, "Oh, well, it's okay, Heather. Stephen took the punishment for you. So there you go." She had no qualms about that, and she would often beat him. They had also made something called a head cage for Stephen. Just Stephen. It would attach to the back. It's a cage, and it would attach to the back of the couch, and Stephen would be forced to watch hours and hours of pornographic videos, like hardcore pornographic videos, some of which starred his mother. And if he blinked at all while he was sitting there, Rose would hit him with an ashtray, or smack him, or things of that nature. It was mostly hitting him with an ashtray. The kids were eventually moved back downstairs, guys. But from that point in time on, they were actually tied to their beds to keep them from trying to escape at night. May, now, like I said, May had claimed that Fred had never raped her. She said that some of the clients did, and she remembers being raped by Fred's brother, John, the only brother he really kind of talked to, that he was closer to, had raped her when she was 5. But Stephen refutes this. He says he does remember both Heather, definitely, and May being sexually abused by their father. May does, or did at the point in time when 25 Cromwell Street, the book she and Stephen wrote together, did acknowledge that she had blocked a lot of the abuse out from her mind. So it's possible that Fred did that. But Stephen recalls a party that happened sometime in 1981. The kids were downstairs. They were trying to sleep. They could hear the adults. They were all drinking. Some of them were getting stoned, including Rose. And everybody was having relations. Everybody everywhere was. Someone came downstairs and got the kids, made them, like, untied them, brought them up. And there was a tree actually being used as a support beam for this particular extension. The kids were tied to this tree and were sexually abused. He remembers seeing Heather and May being groped and grabbed. He remembers his mother groping him, as well as other people. He remembers seeing Heather get raped. And he also remembers that some man urinated on both him and Heather. He said it was the only time that this happened. In fact, he said, quote, "It never happened again, and it never happened before. It seemed to be a one-off idea. the most degrading night, end quote. So he does remember this party happening for sure. And that's just a little hint of some of the stuff that went on at 25 Cromwell Street. This was when the kids made the pact to run away. They made a pact, I should say, that they were gonna escape somehow, no matter what. They had tried already in 1978, or at least people claim they did. Stephen claims they did, but I can't be certain about that. But they said that no matter what, they were getting out of this house. So Anna actually returned to the family in 1982, not to live with them. Well, to live with them, but not by herself, I should say. She returned to the family fold. She had a boyfriend named Chris at this point in time. Now, we know that Anna didn't have a very good life out there on the streets, but she could be a bully to other people. She would pick up men and kick out their wives if they had one, or girlfriends, whoever, in order to have a place to stay for the night. So she could be a bit like Rose, which is really weird because Rose wasn't her mother, but Rose was ostensibly the woman that raised her since she was very young, like a baby. So she took on some of the characteristics of her. She decided that she wanted to call her dad. You guys have to understand, Anna didn't know any different, and she actually did love her dad. I've said it before. All of the kids claim that when Fred wasn't, groping them and stuff, he was actually a nice dad. He could be kind. He would compliment them. He sometimes stopped Rose from abusing them. He could be very, very funny. The kids said that they did have good times with their dad, despite the fact that he was doing these things. And Anna was her father's favorite, which is another reason Rose hated her so much. So she decided to call her dad. The thing is if you came to Cromwell Street, you never showed up unannounced, especially if you were one of the kids. I don't think they cared about the lodgers, but family had to call first. And Rose never answered the phone with a hello, guys. She'd always just say, "What?" And then you'd tell her. That's how she did. But anyway, she had changed her name to just Anne Marie at this point in time. Not Anna Marie, but Anne Marie. And like I said, she'd had it hard. She found it very challenging to survive. And she'd had a lot of traumatic memories. Can you imagine that? All that trauma, and then at 15 years old, trying to support yourself. It's a bit like Eileen Wuornos. So there's no wonder that she ended up doing some of the things that she did. Chris, though, was a different type of man. Like I said, she had used other men and kicked out their girlfriends or wives for a place to stay. Chris stayed with her. Chris and her seemed to genuinely care about each other. So by 1982, once again, most of the lodgers were gone. So at this point in time, they would have a few people drift in and out when need be, but it was actually a number of the lodgers from then on were part of the Letts family. Rose's younger brother Graham lived with them for a while. You guys remember that Bill did for a little tiny bit of a while. Some of the others would show up sporadically too. So at this point in time, Rose's room was changed into a kind of bar/living room deal. And that's where they'd set up the black magic bar. And the customers, partners, whatever, people that they were going to have relations with, whether it be for money or not, would come into this bar living room, would be able to peruse the library of pornographic movies, put one on and prepare themselves, I guess, and have a drink or two before being led into Rose's room for whatever sexual thing they needed to do. And Fred, of course, had hooked up all the listening devices once again into Rose's room, and he had his peepholes and everything, but he could actually hear it in the bar room if he sat there. So the speakers, there were some speakers in the bar room, but he preferred to listen out in the family room, living room that they shared with the children. And of course the children heard everything too, but Rose was loud enough that you could hear things without that. It didn't really matter because Rose's clients would report back to Fred everything that had gone on anyway. He was heavily abusing Heather at this point in time. And May too. It was constant grabbing and groping, constantly trying to fend them off. Sometimes they'd try to make it into a joke so he wouldn't get so angry, because he would get very angry if they fended off his advances. He did the same things as before. He drilled holes into their room so he could watch them. They would go to bed with all of their clothes on over their bed clothes and wait until he'd gone to bed before changing before taking off the first layer. But he'd still find a way to come in the morning, rip back the covers, and try to grope them and get on top of them and things like that. Of course, he would lecture them for hours if they refused him about the fact that dad should be first. Quote, dads know how to do it right, end quote. He also, creepily enough, kept track of their periods. He had a little book where he wrote them all down, and he kept track of that part of the month. Although weirdly enough, when the girls did have their periods, they weren't allowed to do things. They couldn't go swimming. They couldn't ride bikes. They couldn't jump up and down. They couldn't play, anything like that. They weren't allowed to. In October of 1983, Anne Marie was pregnant with Chris's child, with her first child. Her first baby that could be brought to term. Remember, the other one was an ectopic pregnancy and was Fred's anyway. But she was pregnant with Chris's baby, so they decided to marry in January of 1984. The family, minus Rose, showed up to the ceremony. Rose didn't go. There was no reason for it. She just didn't go. And then they kind of had a reception of sorts at Cromwell Street. So Rose, I guess, was at the reception. And Anna's baby was born in 1984. That year was hard for Fred. That summer was hard for Fred. The Wagon Works went bankrupt. Remember the Wagon Works that he had worked at? Actually, he was there for about 10 years, guys. It went bankrupt. And you know Fred, he can't sit around with nothing to do. All he's ever known is work. He has to keep working. And yes, he was still doing repair jobs. He was still being a handyman, but it wasn't a routine set amount of hours like before, and it bothered him. So it kind of threw him into a depression. Another thing you guys didn't know about Fred is that off and on, since getting the head injury, right, at 17, 18, when he hit the wall and got the massive head injury, and also when he fell off the balcony trying to grope a girl and fell 10 feet onto his head, he would fall into depressions. And when he got into those depressions, he would let himself go even more. The kids always described it as his hair got bushier. Apparently, he was big into cutting his hair, just not cleaning up anything else. He also shaved. And he would become more miserable. And it would take less to make him angry. But his misery was directed more toward Rose at this point in time. And they started physically fighting again. They would argue over a lot of different things. He decided, of course, they needed to renovate some more. And the kids were moved back at that point in time. Because remember, sorry, I jumped a little bit back and forth, but the kids were definitely moved back at that point in time into the cellar cemetery. This was when Rose decided, for financial reasons, that more of her customers would pay. Remember before it was only white men that paid? At this point in time, she took to charging some other men. It wouldn't be all of them. Some of them she just called her freebies. But she decided she was going to charge more of her customers in an effort to raise more money for, the renovations, but also the bills and everything. Rose's room was then moved again to a top floor room, one of the ones where the lodgers would have used to live. And directly underneath it was where the bar viewing room, I guess, was installed. So Rose's room would be on top. The room directly below it was now the bar living room area. That's how it stayed for the rest of the time. So they'd do that and then like have their drink, watch their blue movie, and then go upstairs to Rose. The kids were not allowed, like I said before, to see Anne Marie on their own. They weren't allowed, I don't think, to talk to her by phone either. Like if she called, I think they had to immediately get Rose or Fred. But they would sneak out to visit her. They would sneak out to visit Anne Marie. So there was still some relationship there. Chris, Anne Marie's husband, remembers a time when Heather came to visit and said she was miserable and she wanted out. He remembers it distinctly. Though Heather was tough, and when she wanted to be sullen and stroppy, she could be sullen and stroppy for a while. She was also fun to be around when she wasn't being stroppy. Apparently she was like really fun to be around and really a good time. She used to like to make butter in a jar, guys. I actually tried to do this. It never worked, but she loved to do that. She would put the milk or the cream and the salt in it. I don't know what the ratio was. It always worked for her. It never did for me. And just shake it and make butter. She liked to do that. She was just miserable. They talked for a little while, she and Chris, and she alluded to how miserable she was and how much she wanted out to live in the Forest of Dean. It was always the Forest of Dean she wanted to be in. So Anne had another baby in 1987, and Chris was not the father. Much like Fred, see, there's a little bit of a mirroring there. Much like Fred, he was okay with his wife going on vacation once a year with another man. These weren't clients. These were just another boyfriend. She'd be gone for like a week or two and then she'd come back. So this was not Chris's baby, but he was okay with it. At this point in time, though, when she was pregnant, she actually tried to confront Fred and Rose about the abuses they'd heaped on her. She had told Chris some of this and she tried to confront them about it. Of course, Fred denied. Rose just got angry and they threw her out. But that separation didn't last for very long. She must have apologized. It only lasted until March of 1987. And in March of 1987, it was her daughter's 3rd birthday. I don't think it's March, guys. I think it was May of 1987. But I could be wrong. One of her children was having a birthday party. In fact, it may have even been June. I think she tried to confront her parents in March. Sorry, guys. Sometimes the timeline got really wonky. It would be in June, sometime in June. It was her daughter's 3rd birthday and she was having a party and the whole family did show up. So she must have gotten back a hold of them. However, Heather was really acting out at this party. She was swearing a lot. She was telling people to F off, that she just wanted to be alone. Fred and Rose were actively trying to make her take part. It was clear she didn't want to. She was sullen. She was angry. She was biting her nails. She just didn't want to be there. And a number of the neighbors actually complained to Anne Marie. And Anne Marie called up Fred and Rose and told them about this. I guess it was so bad that she said she didn't want anything to do with Heather anymore. But regardless, 2 days later, on June 19th, 1987, 16-year-old Heather West disappeared. Yes, you heard me, guys. So on the 18th, the day before, Heather had had a really big life blow. She was a very smart child, guys. She was very intellectual. She did very well in school. And she had finished school by this point in time and was actively looking for a job. And she was looking everywhere. There was a summer camp she heard about in Devon, and she desperately wanted to go there. Her job would be like cleaning up these little chalet style homes that people would camp in. That's the general picture I got from that. She would be working as a cleaner at this camp and she was very excited about it. She applied for it. She heard back from the people saying she didn't get the job, let's just say, on the 18th. And she spent the whole night in tears. Now, this is Heather. Heather's a hard kid, but she spent the whole night crying. All of the kids could hear it. The kids do remember seeing her in the morning, although there is some oddity about that. But I do remember Stephen and May saying they did remember. You'll know why later. They did remember seeing her in the morning. They could describe what she was wearing. And I think she was biting her nails. And then they left for school. And Rose ostensibly left to take the younger kids to school. They always went to school. When they got home, Heather was gone. And it was obvious that Rose had been crying. Now, Rose can cry when she wants to, but it was obvious she had been crying and she was a little out of it, a little put out for the next few days. Fred told them that the job was back on. that Heather was going to be going to Devon to work at this camp, and that she left with a lesbian in a red Mini. That's what he said. So over the next little while, few years, phone calls would come in, and of course it would be Fred and Rose answering, and they would make sure that they'd say Heather's name. What do you want, Heather? Blah, blah, blah. So the kids thought that Heather was calling, but it turns out it was actually somebody they'd hired or somebody they'd asked to do this. So it assuaged the kids' fears that something had gone on with Heather, but they knew it wasn't quite right because they couldn't understand why Heather wasn't calling them or trying to come and see them. Heather and Stephen and May were very close, so it didn't make a lot of sense to them. In fact, at several points in time, the kids contacted shows. Some of them contacted the Salvation Army to help with missing people. They contacted a missing show, and they contacted another show that would reunite families in the hopes that they could get Heather's story out there, but also in the hopes that they could get them to bring her to them. Of course, they never heard back from any of these places. And Anne Marie often went out to look for her too. No one ever saw her aside from Fred. Periodically, he would say, oh yeah, I saw your sister today, or I saw Heather and she's working as a prostitute now, or she's living rough, or she's selling drugs. He was always throwing Heather under the bus, always muddying her name and making these outrageous claims about his own daughter. At one point in time, the kids did want to go to the police. Fred dissuaded them from it. Of course, we know how persuasive he is, but these are his own children, so he just would have beat them anyway. He told them that she was involved in credit card fraud and involved with a drug cartel. And if the kids went to the police, they would be putting her in trouble. So they mustn't do that. They mustn't make any more trouble for Heather. From 1979 until 1987, I know what you guys are thinking, from Allison Chambers to Heather West, there were no murders at 25 Cromwell Street. There were no more murders. There were no other bodies found. However, I do not want you guys to think that Fred stopped. It's just impossible. That's just too long of a gap. 8 years for a man and a woman that were killing on a yearly basis, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. I think there was 1 year. Yeah, definitely 3 in 1974. So for people who were doing it that actively to suddenly stop for 8 years, it doesn't make sense. I think Fred just took it elsewhere. Most people think that. In fact, the police think that. Most other people that know this story, most other people that have even, some other people that have even talked to Fred, Stephen for sure, said that Fred alluded to there being other bodies. If they had been killing once a year since, ostensibly, if Fred had been killing once a year since 1967, and Rose had been killing since 1971 with Charmaine, by 1987, Fred would have been killing for 20 years, ostensibly, if we believe that Anne, or Anna, they also call her Anna McFall, if we believe that she was his first victim. I don't think he would have stopped for 8 years. It just doesn't make sense. He never stopped before. I think he just started killing in other areas or took the bodies to other areas to dispose of. I think at some point in time, we're going to hear rumors, or they're going to dig somewhere and find a body that will be dismembered. Fred himself alluded to the fact that there were more than 20 to 30, I believe he said, but maybe even more. It wouldn't make sense that they stopped, guys. So don't think that he stopped. We just don't know where the rest of the bodies are. Yeah, we just don't know. Plus, Fred was only like, what, 42? Was he only 42 in 1987? 46 in 1987. I don't think he was done killing yet. And also, he knew the area, right? He knew Gloucester really well. He knew the area, the region of Gloucestershire really well. He knew Much Marco really well. He knew all of those places really well. So he knew lots of places to hide a body. According to Fred, he waited until Rose took the younger kids to school. He and Heather were downstairs in the tool room. Remember the tool room? There was a tool room in the cellar. It was also the area where the family's washer and dryer were. Heather was leaning up against the washer, telling him that she was going to leave anyway, that she'd packed up all of her stuff, and she was going to leave. He was trying to dissuade her from leaving. She said that if he didn't let her go, she was going to give acid to all the kids and make them jump off the roof and die. That made him angry, and he claims that he strangled her to death. He strangled her until she turned blue, just with his hands. And then she slumped down, and he claims he tried to revive her several times, but of course she didn't come to, and she was dead, so he went about his work. Sorry. He was afraid she wasn't completely dead, so he strangled her again with a pair of tights. However, he also conceded that he may have strangled, yeah, this is the way he talks, he may have strangled her with a copper wire as well. He then dismembered her in the bathtub that was downstairs to, I guess, keep the mess to a minimum. And put her, she was decapitated and her legs were off. And she was missing bones like the other victims. He also claims to have decapitated his victims to make sure they were dead too. He put her pieces originally in a large trash can. I'm assuming it was a trash can, guys. They said bin. I think it was trash can. And put it in an area that wasn't as used by the kids. So he wasn't as worried that the kids would go there. And he later buried her in the yard and built a patio over top of her. In fact, some of the kids remember helping build this patio. When he did confess to the murder of Heather, he was emotionless. He kept blaming her for things. He kept saying that she was a lesbian. I don't know how they figured that she was. He said once she was a lesbian because he found her urinating on a bed. I don't know. He said all of these horrible things about Heather. They both did. Even though Rose knew Heather was dead, she said terrible things about her daughter too, trying to paint her as a very bad person. I don't think Heather was. Not at all. I think she was just deeply traumatized. The kids often ate at a picnic table that was directly over top of Heather's body. And Fred would barbecue from an area where he could actually look at that part too. So it was good times. It became a running threat / joke in the house that if you didn't behave, you'd end up under the patio like Heather. It was a running joke. The kids didn't believe it. They just thought that their sister ran away. That's what their parents had told them. They really didn't know. They didn't know about Fred's murders at that point in time either. They just knew their family was not normal, but they thought Heather had run away. Eventually, they just assumed this was their dad's sense of humor. So, in 1988, Fred and Rose entered into a mutual three-way relationship with a woman named Catherine Halliday. Catherine Halliday also had a girlfriend, but she doesn't seem like she was involved in this relationship. Catherine eventually broke it off because it was way too aggressive. She broke it off after about 4 months, and she said that Rose in particular, I should say, was very aggressive. Was very persuasive, but highly aggressive, and that she seemed to derive pain from other people, or she seemed to derive pleasure from other people's pain. Sorry, guys. She definitely pushed the boundaries sexually, especially with their version of BDSM. We talked about that in the last video, guys. Of course, there's no consent. Maybe with Catherine Halliday there was, so I guess, but with most of the relationships, when they were practicing their version of it, there was no consent. So it wasn't BDSM, but they had all the kink gear for it too, I guess, like the ball gags, the rubber suits, the face masks, all of that stuff. And part of that terrified Catherine as well. She said, quote, "When she got you into a vulnerable position physically and mentally, she would use that against your person," end quote. Rose seemed to love causing pain to her female partners and victims. They said that. In fact, she would hurt them and then say, "What's the matter? Aren't you woman enough to take it?" That's what she'd say to them. In 1989, Stephen turned 16, and as a present, his parents kicked him out. They rented a bed sit for him. which is like basically a one room apartment. Like it's just one room. They live in the room, but they share like a bathroom and a common room kitchen with other people. They rented him this room. It was close to home. I think it was on the other side of the church. So 25 Cromwell here. Here's the church. Here's where Stephen's bedsit was. So they kicked him out. They told him he could only visit for 1 hour on Sundays, and that he was not supposed to talk to his siblings, etc. Like all of the other things that had gone on. The most likely reason for this is that the school had an inkling, let's just say, that Stephen was being severely physically abused at home. And they started asking questions. Of course, Stephen denied it. He'd always say, no, I'm okay, everything's fine. But questions were being raised. Fred and Rose can't have this. The easiest solution is to get rid of Stephen. Now, I want you to know that Stephen had his own ways of disassociating, his own ways of dealing with this trauma, and they were not nice guys. He would often pick on his biracial sisters, mocking their appearance, the fact that they didn't know who their dads were, etc., etc. He'd call them terrible names, and he would start fights with them. He would also run away a lot. He just didn't have it well there, but he didn't know any other way to live. But at this point in time, he's ousted from the house. In 1989, May also left. She moved in with her boyfriend at that point in time. She too was told she could only visit for an hour on Sundays. They were effectively cut out, much like Anna had been too. And remember, you never showed up unannounced. They would tell you what particular time you could go there. By this time, though, Fred had thankfully secured another job. He secured one in 1988. It was with the Carson Company. Carson Contractors. So this gave him the routine he needed again. He's out of his depression, things of that nature. I do want you guys to know that at some point in time, I don't know exactly when, Rose signed at least 2 slave contracts for Fred, calling herself his cow and saying that she would be willing to do anything and everything to sexually please her husband, or to please her husband in any way. And if not, she could be punished, yada, yada, yada. If you guys ever heard about Colleen Stan, the girl in the box, Cameron and Janice Hooker, if you've ever heard of that case, Colleen was made to sign a slave contract. Fred and Rose did this too, their own kind of contracts. But anyway, she did call herself Fred's cow. That was a big thing between them, cows and bulls having relations, I guess. And so by 1989, Rose had decided she wanted to have kids again for whatever reason. The younger kids were getting older. Maybe she just wanted another baby. I mean, she's getting up there in age, but she definitely decided she wanted to reverse her tubal ligation. It did work. And I believe it was 1993, actually, guys, when she got pregnant. So Rose at that point in time would have been about 40. However, she miscarried the baby. And after that, they didn't try again. But it did change Rose a little bit. She started fighting back against Fred. She was only, 36 in 1989. 37. And it was around that point in time where she decided there had to be more to life. She didn't want to do just what Fred asked her to. I'm sorry if the dates are kind of confusing, guys. They confused me a little bit too, because there is some jump around. But it appears that she decided she wanted another life, or what she really wanted was her husband to be a husband. She wanted him to take her out more, not so she could find other men, but so that they could have a good time together, dancing and stuff like that, whatever it is that they couples did, I guess. She wanted to do that. She just wanted some freedom. She started actually seeing another man, and when Fred found out, he of course flipped. She said that if he wasn't going to let her do what she wanted, she wasn't going to do what he wanted. So for a time, she stopped being a prostitute. But eventually, Fred was able to persuade her to be. For revenge on this, she actually rented an apartment in 1991, and it was for about 5 months. And of course, when Fred found that out, he was angry and crushed. It sent him into another depression, but they appeared to have patched things up after that. She had enough of her taste for life, I guess. In 1992, Fred's father died. And this is when he and John, the brother he was closest to, actually stopped speaking. Well, Dad's dead. I don't need to talk to you anymore. So he's out of the picture now. Heather had been gone at this point for 5 years. Of course, the kids are still very confused. They have no idea why Heather isn't coming to see them, isn't trying to talk to them on the phone, not sending a letter, nothing. They have no idea why their sister won't talk to them. And of course, they're still joking around about her being underneath the patio. Now, in 1992, Fred raped Louise at least 3 times. I know you're going to ask, what about Tara, Luciana, and Rosemary Jr.? Those 3 girls were never subjected to Fred's sexual abuse. Part of it was the fact that they weren't really his daughters. Even Tara said, because we didn't belong to him, we weren't his property. But part of it was also because he kind of was a racist, and, you know, yeah. Now, in this book, it actually said that Fred wasn't a racist, that he was friends with the Jamaicans, but the kids also agree that he was a racist. So I can't be completely certain, guys, but as far as I know, he was a raging racist, and that was one of the reasons why he never abused the younger 3 girls. However, they all got physically abused by their mother. Like, we're talking the deep-seated physical abuse that Rose does. But Fred, whether this was his biological child or the child of one of Rose's white customers, did rape Louise in 1992. Rose knew about it, and when Louise said something, she'd asked her daughter what she expected. What do you expect? It serves you right. You were asking for it. That's what Rose said to her daughter. So Louise did tell a friend, and I'm not completely sure on this, guys. The friend either told her mother, who went to the police, or the friend asked police themselves about it, or told police about it themselves. Regardless, CAS was what. I'm sorry. It's CAS here, right? The Children's Aid Society. I know it's CPS in some places in the States. Child Protective Services, I guess, decided to look into the case, as did police. In August, police descended on 25 Cromwell Street, where they found, of course, the massive pornographic collection, as well as all the sex toys and the implements. There was apparently, according to someone, a tape made of him abusing Louise, of him raping Louise, and they really wanted to find that tape. I don't think they ever did, but they did, of course, take away all of the pornography and all of the sex toys at that point in time. They took the younger kids into care, and they were able to charge Fred and Rose. Rose told the kids as she was being arrested, quote, "Don't you say anything," end quote, or "Don't you dare say anything," end quote. Fred denied everything and convinced Stephen to take the fall for raping Louise. Anne Marie had actually given a statement at this point corroborating Louise's abuse. She told all the abuse, the sexual abuse from Fred and Rose, and I think the physical abuse that Rose had heaped on her as well. She told everything. So the police are super suspicious at this point in time. May, however, said that her father was a good man. He was a good dad, and he was a good man. May and Louise met in secret, because remember, the kids are in care at this point in time, met in secret and decided, for the betterment of the family, in order to keep the family together, they were going to not testify. They would say their dad was a good man. Not Louise so much, more May. It had been beaten into their heads since they were babies, guys, since they were toddlers, that anybody in authority was going to tear the family apart, that if they said anything about what happened in the house, the family was going to be torn apart by the authorities. They were taught to mistrust police. Police are only going to try to tear apart the family, so they had that mindset, and Louise did not want to be responsible for tearing the family apart. Stephen did recant his original statement because in his statement he said yes, that Louise was raped by his dad. He recanted it and said, no, I was the one that raped Louise. At this point in time, there's too much evidence against Fred. And well, I shouldn't say there's too much evidence. There's been too much talk by other people, so nobody believes Stephen. And he eventually did say, no, my original statement was the true one. And also Anne Marie asked, also recanted her statement because she felt that if she went through with it, her stepmom and her dad would do something to her. She was afraid for her children's safety and her own safety. So Rose was released on bail, and of course she wasn't allowed to have contact with the younger kids. When she came home, she tried to overdose on some pills. I think it was May and Stephen that found her, and they took her to a hospital and pumped her stomach. She was fine. Later on, Rose was allowed to have supervised contact with her younger children. Fred, I believe, was also allowed that once he was let out of prison too, or once he was let out too. But Rose only went to see them once, and Fred never went. They were of the mindset that if they couldn't see their children alone, to threaten and bully them into saying that home life was fine and to warn them to keep their mouths shut, if they couldn't see their children alone and on their own terms, then they didn't want to see them at all. That was it for them. Rose did visit Fred, though. And according to the kids, they fell in love all over again. There was hand holding. There were phone calls where they called each other sweetheart and darling. There were a flurry of letters like before, yada, yada, yada. They would basically meet each other, kiss, and immediately drop down to have relations with each other. So much so to the point that the kids actually bought them a tent so they could conduct their business there when they were visiting. Fred was charged actually with 3 counts of rape and 1 of buggery. Rose was charged with, quote, causing or encouraging the commission of unlawful sexual intercourse, end quote, and child cruelty. So on June 7th, 1993, the charges were dropped, guys, because Louise refused to testify against her father, and also they had the statement from May too. But their star witness refused to testify against her father, so the case fell apart. Fred and Rose were able to go home together. And the thing that bothered Fred most was that he was mad at the way they had tore up the house and that his pornographic videos were missing. He wanted to start making those videos again immediately so they could replace what was gone. And I do want you guys to know that because the pornography was missing, a lot of the police wonder if some of the victims may not, or I should say people wonder now. I'm wondering what happened though if police took it into custody. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But people were wondering if maybe those victims, or if maybe some of that pornography, because some of it was commercial, a lot of it was homemade, and it was mostly hardcore, like torture stuff. They wonder if maybe there weren't videos, snuff videos of the victims being murdered or at least being sexually abused in that cache of tapes. But we don't know for sure, guys. Rose at this point in time, of course, didn't agree with Fred, and she didn't want to make the porn again. So a DC named Hazel Savage, a police officer, who had actually had many, many dealings with the West since like 1966. And she had heard enough from the children to be interested in finding Heather. The police knew they really needed to talk to Heather if they wanted to have any case at all against Fred. So they were actively looking for Heather. But she promised the kids that they would find Heather. So the one good thing that came from this travesty of a court case where they got off again was that she promised the kids they'd look for Heather. She had also heard enough of the rumors from the kids. The kids in care actually told their foster parents, some of the kids in care actually told their foster parents that Heather was under the patio. And they'd heard enough about that joke to start actively trying to find her. And of course, at this point in time, they noticed she had no work history. There was no bank accounts or anything like that. And they also noticed that her national security number, her national insurance number, like our social security number, guys, had not been accessed at all. So how is it that she'd been missing for 5 years and 6 years? Oh gosh, it's more than that. 6 years at this point in time, and has never once tried to access benefits or health care or anything like that. This is very suspicious to the police. Fred and Rose, though, from the point in 1992 when they were accused of child sexual abuse, did not abuse their kids anymore. The kids said that Rose really mellowed out at this point in time and was no longer actively physically abusing them. They also said, of course, though Stephen and May didn't live at home at this point in time, but they would more often come to visit. She mellowed out at this point in time, and Fred stopped trying to sexually touch them. Although I think this is more or less because they learned sometimes there are consequences, and also because they figured they were on police radar. So on February 23rd, 1994, police finally got a warrant to search 25 Cromwell Street, and they enacted it on February 24th. Fred took a long time to get home. In fact, Stephen repeatedly called him, and he was only about an hour and a half away, and I think they originally called him at 1. It may have even been a little bit before 1. He didn't come home until after 5:30. What was he doing in that time? I have no idea, guys. It's possible he could have just been visiting all the places where he buried bodies one last time. I think at this point in time, he knows time's up for him. Secrets are going to come out. Regardless, he showed up after 5:30. The police had already gone home at that point in time. They were just starting their search. I think they left a uniformed officer there for overnight. But the majority of the police officers were gone. Rose was, of course, crying, but Fred was not angry. He was eerily calm that night, guys. And he and Rose spoke at length in whispered tones for a while. And then at 7:30, Fred went to the police station, not really to turn himself in, but to answer to the charges, to be like, why are you doing this to me? 7:45 p.m. he went there. Rose denied Heather was dead. She maintained that she had left with a lesbian in the Red Mini, and that they talked to her on the phone. Fred also denied her death, saying, once again, lesbian, left with, Red Mini. They talked to her on the phone and that he'd seen her several times. They denied that anything had happened to Heather. He was let out that night because there's nothing concrete to arrest him on at this point in time. And he went home for the very last time. So on February 25th, maybe after talking with Rose again, Fred confessed to the murder of Heather West. He also told police where they could find her. She was indeed under the patio, but they hadn't been looking in the right spot. Now, the reason why he wanted them to know exactly where Heather was because he didn't really want them to find the other bodies. Remember what I said. A couple more are out there in the yard for sure. And, can't really have that over your head. So he did ostensibly give them the area where Heather should be. So he was arrested, of course, for Heather's murder. And Rose at this point in time was arrested too. But Fred repeatedly said that Rose had nothing to do with it, that she had no idea what was going on, that it was him alone. He was protecting her, and he did this pretty much to the end. I'm going to say pretty much. We'll get into that. He said everything was his fault. Now, the next day he recanted it and went back to his story saying that Heather was still alive. But by this point in time, police had found femur bones, guys. They had found some bones. In fact, like I said, they found not 1, not 2, but 3 femur bones, which basically led them to know that there were other bodies. Heather can't have 3 legs. So they did find Heather's body. And the second one was Ellison Chambers, of course. Eventually, Fred told them, it was through roundabout ways. He would deny it. Oh no, I didn't know those people. Or, oh no, nothing happened. Or they went away on their own. Yeah, I killed them. I did this to them. But no, they're still alive. So he would jump back and forth like that, guys. And he was hard to understand, right? Because he's basically illiterate. Sometimes he'd confess, sometimes he'd recant it. Sometimes he would say there were 20 or 30 more bodies out there and then recant it. It was more to Stephen he said this. In fact, he told Stephen that Mary Baston, remember we talked about her in the first video, she disappeared in 1967, 66 or 67, somewhere in there, sorry guys. Mary Baston disappeared and he told Stephen that he had killed her. Stephen told him that they were looking in the cafe, the pop-up cafe, or the pop-in cafe that she had worked in, and that she had served Fred in. Remember, he was a customer at that point in time. They looked around in there, but didn't find anything. And when Stephen reported that back to Fred, Fred said, well, there's no use looking there. They won't find her there. Now, earlier this year, it was early summer. I think it was June, guys. I might be a little bit off on my dates. There was another search for Mary Baston's body. He refused to talk about her, just like Anna McFall. He didn't want to talk about that. He only wanted to tell the police what he absolutely had to. He knew they were going to destroy Cromwell Street, so he had to admit to all those bodies, but he didn't have to admit to the others. And since they knew that Anne McFall was last seen with him, that Rena was his wife, and about Charmaine, kind of. I don't really know why he confessed to those ones, but he would not confess to anything else. He wanted to have all the cards, and he would do it when he felt like it. So he did say that she wasn't there. Now, they did, I think it was the Pop-In Cafe, or the site at Pop-In Cafe. They started excavating it. At first, they took ground-penetrating radars. As far as I know, guys, you can look it up if you want to. And they found disturbances in the soil. So they did look at it, but of course she wasn't found, guys. And Fred did say she wasn't there. It's possible he could have buried there because he did do work there, and then like he did with Charmaine, reburied her somewhere else. The kids, of course, were horrified and were filled with sadness at knowing the truth about Heather. Like, they had thought that was a joke. They never thought their parents were capable of something like that. Their own sister. This was their own daughter, their own first daughter. The daughter that brought Fred and Rose to be married, to be living together. That brought them together, ostensibly, if you think about it. Like, the daughter she refused to abort, only to 16 years later have her father murder her and her mother be okay with it. There is also some conjecture, guys, that Heather might not have been Fred's daughter, but the daughter of Bill Letts, Rose's dad. But that's just conjecture, guys. I do think that Heather was Fred's daughter. She looked a lot more like Rose, but I'm just saying there was some conjecture, so I'm going to get that out of the way. So Fred kept telling people that Rose had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. Police didn't believe this. They'd been together too long. It just didn't make sense. They were very close, let's just say. Rose tried to deny everything and say they had lived a separate life, but the police didn't believe that. So they put her up in a number of safe houses in the city. And it was actually her and May and Stephen originally, but Stephen and Rose had another falling out, so he was ousted after a little while. Oh, Lola never wants to sit with me on the couch. So anyway, they were living at safe houses, but police were really savvy, and they actually bugged all these safe houses, and I think they bugged the telephones too. I think Rose actually knew about that, in the hopes of trying to get her saying something incriminating, but she never did. Heather was found first, then Allison Chambers, like I said before, then Shirley Robinson, Therese Segenthaler, I hope I'm saying it right, sorry guys, Shirley Hubbard, Lucy Partington, I may have said Lucy Parrington in the last video, I apologize guys, Juanita Mott, Linda Go, and then Carol Ann Cooper. They were all found at the house. Another interesting thing to know is that Juanita Mott's sister, Belinda, used to visit 25 Cromwell Street in the years after Juanita disappeared as a friend, maybe to visit some of the lodgers, I don't know, but she ended up partying there somewhat, never knowing that she was partying on her sister's grave. Can you believe that? Oh my God, can you imagine the shock of that? So Rose was rearrested on April 23rd of 1994 and formally charged with the murder of Heather West and Linda Go. Ostensibly because they talked to Mrs. Go and they knew that Rose had had articles of her clothing. She refused to answer any questions regarding the murder. She repeatedly pled innocence. She still does to this day, and didn't say a word until it was time for her trial. Now, at one point in time, Fred and Rose were in the docket together where they were being jointly charged, right? To answer the charges with guilty or not guilty type things. Either that or it was to have their charges read to them and be formally charged. Regardless, they were in the docket together because, of course, they're being charged together. Fred tried to touch Rose, or Fred did touch Rose, or tried to touch her shoulder when they first walked in because he deeply loved her. Sorry, guys. And she just shrank away from him. And Fred couldn't believe it. You could see in his face how hurt and devastated he was by this. I know, right? Like, the man has feelings. He tried to touch her once again when they were leaving, and she just put up her face and nope, wouldn't have anything to do with him. By now, at this point in time, even though Fred is still telling people that she had nothing to do with it, she was telling everybody she hated him. She couldn't believe what he did. He ruined her life, things of that nature. Because Rose gave up on him, because Rose seemed to no longer love him, no longer care about him, wouldn't answer his letters that he wrote to her, Fred fell into a depression, a deep depression, guys. He could not believe that his one true love, quote unquote, however, yeah, he could not believe that she'd turn her back on her, but she did. However, Stephen was still going to visit Fred, and that's the reason why he and Rose had a falling out, because she didn't want him to be loyal to Fred, but he's still visiting Fred. Fred to him was a reasonably good parent, right? Stephen wasn't sexually abused by his father. He wasn't really beaten by his father. It was Rose that did all that. So he had a better relationship with his father, particularly when he was older. He wrote to him often, and he would visit them. He would ask for tobacco and batteries. That was the thing he wanted. And he would always tell him how much he loved his family and how much he wanted to keep them together. He sometimes would allude to the fact that there were more bodies out there, sometimes say that he wasn't involved at all. And he would sometimes talk about what he'd done in a roundabout way. Remember, kind of like Ted Bundy, when he'd talk about his crimes in a third person? Fred would talk about things in a roundabout way too. Sometimes he'd feign innocence. Sometimes he claimed that somebody had actually set him up, that the whole thing was a setup, and the real person would come out. He did allude to many people that he was taking the rap for somebody, or that somebody else was involved. In fact, sometimes he blamed certain things on Rena. Just like I said with Anna McFall, he actually blamed that on Rena and another man. And sometimes he alluded to other people that Bill Letts was involved. It sounds like a couple of maybe Rose's clients and somebody else. Now that somebody else could have been Fred himself, but I'm just saying he'd allude to things like that. But by the end of the year, he seemed pretty depressed, guys. In May and June, he had finally told the police where to find Rena, Charmaine, and Anna McFall, although he denied right to the end ever killing Anna McFall, even though he admitted to dismembering her and he knew where she was buried. He refused to admit he killed her. And he put out his autobiography, which was like Loved by an Angel, or When I Was Loved by an Angel. We discussed that in the first film. Talking about how she was the greatest thing. She was so gentle. She was the best. He loved her so much. She was like an angel in the flesh, things of that nature. That when he was in prison, he wrote that book. So he refused to admit he killed her, but he knew where she was. However, he did lead police to the rest of the remains that we know about. He kept writing to Rose. Of course, she never responded. He'd also send messages to May through Stephen because she didn't want to visit him. Although Anne Marie did visit Fred. She kept visiting him. He wrote to her when it was close to her birthday that she was the best thing to ever happen to him, that he loved her, and quote, "When you are ready, come to me. I will be waiting for you," end quote. Of course, Rose is still not answering and telling people, especially the kids, that he ruined her life, blah, 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 blah. He sent a picture with a gravestone to one of the kids saying that this is what he wanted in the event that he passed. And he said that this was the inscription he wanted. Quote, rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife, end quote. That's what he wanted written. He worked in the prison at this point in time mending shirts, guys. And during this point in time, while he was working, he was able to secrete small lengths of cloth back with him. Enough to make a really strong rope. And on January 1st, 1995, Fred West hung himself and was dead. That's why I wondered about Robin Holt, guys. Remember we talked about him in the first video? Did Fred kill Robin Holt? Let me know what you think. He hung himself. And he took every answer to every question with him. He took, why he took everything went with him when he died. All of his secrets. Why he took certain bones from people. How many more bodies there were. How far Rose was involved in this. All of these things. All of those secrets went to the grave with him. Of course, they decided to cremate him, knowing full well, because Fred wanted to be buried with his parents. Daisy had long since passed, guys. Sorry, I didn't mention that. Fred wanted to be buried at the family plot in Much Markle. Of course, you guys know vandalism's going to occur, things of that nature, so it's not a good idea. So the kids had him cremated instead. Anne Marie actually stole his ashes. No one knows where they are to this day. Maybe Anne Marie wrote about it in her book. I wasn't able to find that book, guys. Sorry. But to this day, not sure where they are. Rose was put on trial on October 3rd of 1995. So Anne Marie, Caroline Owens, who we've already talked about, Daisy Letts, and a number of former lodgers all testified against her. She at times would appear tearful and like a schoolgirl. In fact, that's what people always said they remembered about Rose. She always, throughout her life, dressed like a schoolgirl, like the little plaid kilt type things, or with the cardigan and the white blouse when she was dressed at all, and white knee socks. She always dressed very childlike. So she was sometimes tearful, sometimes humorous. She claimed that she had never even met 6 of the victims. She had no idea who they were, and that she and Fred lived, quote, separate lives, end quote, despite what other people said. She said that she agreed that she and Heather had a very contentious relationship. She called Heather a lesbian, said that Heather was the one that had been abusing the children, that she would punch them in the face or slam their hands in doors or make them drink vinegar mixed with all these other things, when it was actually Rose that had done that. But she made sure that people believed that that was Heather, just to further hurt her name even more. She still stuck to the story that she thought that Heather had left with the lesbian in the red Mini, and she swore up and down that Heather had called them and that Fred had seen her. The final witness called, this would be for the prosecution, I believe, was Janet Leach. Now, Janet Leach had a relationship of sorts with Fred. She worked for the police force, and she was his appropriate appointed adult because Fred was basically illiterate. He would need somebody to help him to understand the charges, to help him look up medical things. Sorry, not medical things, to help him look up things for his defense, to explain to him what the lawyers were doing, things of that nature. And she developed a kind of relationship with him. Although her testimony is not without controversy, guys, and we'll get into that. But he apparently started to confide things in her, things that he didn't tell people. And one of the things he said was that Rose was very much involved with almost everything. He said that night before, on February 24th, when they first came in with the warrant, but the two of them were having those whispers conversations, he had agreed to take all of the blame for the murders and say that Rose was completely innocent. He had agreed to do that, despite the fact that she kind of threw him under the bus. He had agreed to take the blame. He said that many of the murders, or a few of the murders, were Rose's mistakes. So alluding to the fact that Rose had killed a number of them herself. He claimed, of course, which is something we pretty much already knew, that Rose had killed Shar while he was in prison, and that she had killed Shirley Robinson due to the jealousy over her being pregnant with his child at the same time, and had taken the fetus out of her stomach. And he also claimed that she had helped Fred dismember Shirley Robinson for sure. Fred said Rose, quote, had played a major part, end quote, in the murders. So Janet's testimony, like I said, was not without its controversy, because she did lie under oath, guys. Not about Fred in particular, but she was asked if she had tried to sell her story to a tabloid, or if she had broken confidentiality, I guess, to some extent, over that. And she said no. She vehemently denied trying to sell her side of the story with Fred to a newspaper. However, it was uncovered that she had verbally entered into an agreement to sell her story for something like £100,000, I think, guys. And of course, this tainted her testimony, because it looked like she was selling out and willing to say whatever just so she could make money. It was controversial, but at the same point in time, she was adamant. She was, quote, adamant about the sincerity of her testimony, end quote. She said, it doesn't matter. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this to tell the truth. Fred told me that Rose was involved. And really, at this point in time, guys, I don't know how many of us can believe that Rose didn't know what was going on. It seems pretty far-fetched, especially since we know what she did to Caroline Owens, right? And Catherine Halliday. So on November 21st and 22nd of 1995, Rose was actually found guilty of 10 murders. Of course, she can't be blamed for Rena or Anne McFall, because ostensibly in 1967, she didn't know Fred. And of course, Fred tried to say that it was Rena and this other man that had killed Anna McFall. I always wondered about that. So I'm glad it was confirmed. That was my theory. That was my theory of how he persuaded Rose to do these things initially. Initially, she was, of course, sentenced to 25 years to life, which is the same as it is here. In England, it's the same as it is here in Canada. So life is a 25-year sentence. We're technically still part of the monarchy, guys. That's the Queen is more of a figurehead in our politics, but she is still consulted on some matters. That's why it's never the province or territory when it's a murder charge or a rape charge or something that involves all of Canada. What is that? When it's common law, not civil law. When it's a charge of Canada versus someone for murder. So let's say Canada versus Alan Legier. It won't show up that way. It'll show up as R versus Alan Legier. The R stands for either Rex or Regina. That's the Queen. The Queen or King, you've committed atrocities against them. So that's why the R is there, guys. It's either Rex or Regina. It'd be Regina now. You can look it up, guys. It'll say Regina versus Alan Legier, R versus Alan Legier, because we're still technically part of the Commonwealth. We're still technically part of that. Even though we have our own charter, we're our own country, we're definitely a sovereign nation. Back when we back when England agreed to let us be our own country, I guess, all the way in 1867, back when we formally separated from the Commonwealth, we are still technically a part of it. And the Queen still does have a say in how certain parts of our court system go. Sorry, just to make that clear. So it makes sense that life is 25 years there. But that was later changed to a whole life or full life tariff. That's kind of like being a dangerous offender here in Canada. You know that if you guys get a dangerous offender status, we talked about this with Paul Bernardo and I believe Alan Legier. Clifford Olson, if you guys remember, when you are designated a dangerous offender, that means that you can spend an inordinate amount of time in prison. So after 25 years, you might come up for parole and they'll say no. Or you might come up for parole after 55 years and they'll say no. You know, Paul Bernardo, he wasn't that old. So now there were currently, give or take, about 550 people that were classified as dangerous offenders in the last little bit. About 550 people, give or take, guys. Of that, only about 20 of them were ever released from prison. So only about 5% ever have a chance of getting paroled. If you are declared a dangerous offender, you can be held in prison for an inordinate amount of time. It could be your whole life. It could be most of your life. It can be revoked. It's very, very hard, but it can be. If you get a whole life tariff, in England, it's the same thing. It means you'll be there for the rest of your life. And Rose West was only the second woman in modern history to ever receive that designation. Of course, the first being Myra Hindley, one half of the Moors murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. But anyway, she was transferred a few times, guys, from prisons, but she now resides in HM Prison Newhall in West Yorkshire. She did appeal in 1996. She did appeal her sentence, but of course was denied. But in 2001, even though she still says she still says she's innocent, she still to this day says she's innocent, guys. In 2001, she said she wasn't going to go through with the appeal process anymore. She wasn't going to use any of her appeals. She would no longer apply for them, although she still maintains her innocence. Apparently while in prison, according to a 2020 documentary, I've not watched this, guys. This is just rumor. This is just hearsay. It's called, quote, Rose West and Myra Hindley, Their Untold Story, end quote. Apparently they were housed at some point in time in the same prison, and the two of them actually became lovers. Then something happened within the relationship, so they became rivals to see who could be the queen bee of the prison system, more or less. To be prison royalty, that's what they said. So, like I said, Rose is still in prison. She denies everything. Fred is dead. Now, you guys might wonder about the kids. So, Stephen West actually did try to commit suicide a couple times. In fact, John West, I believe, committed suicide, as well as a cousin. But he did try to commit suicide in 2002. Of course, that didn't happen. He's still alive. But he was actually jailed in 2004. And this is the reason why he and May don't speak that often, guys. Because he was arrested for having sex with a 14-year-old girl. And he was in his 30s at that point, guys. And when the reason people found out is because she became pregnant and he took her to have an abortion. So, I mean, he went through a lot of trauma, guys. But at the same point in time, he was arrested for doing one of the very things that his dad did. Now, he claims this relationship was consensual. Regardless, he suffered a lot of trauma, guys, especially with knowing that he slept on bodies and that his own sister was murdered by his parents and buried out in the backyard. What was a family joke was actually reality. He knew about the sexual abuse. He knew about all of that. So I know he has definite trauma, guys. Regardless, he was arrested. He did, though, manage to turn his life around. He does have a couple of kids. He has been married more than once. I think he's been married and divorced twice. He does have a few kids, but he did turn his life around. He got therapy and stuff like that. I think he works as a builder now in England. He was prone to fits of abuse, of abusive rage, guys. He did hit at least one of his wives. He could get very angry, and he could be like Fred, or I should say he could be like both Fred and Rose. I think it took him a while to get angry like Fred, but he could hurt you like Rose. However, he's doing much better now by all reports anyway. May said in 2018 that she and he had little contact. They only maybe text, maybe talk a handful of times a year. Stephen did talk about helping to build what would be his father's grave, or his sister's grave. He did talk about that. So that's an intense amount of trauma too. Mae West went on to have at least 2 children. She did receive many letters from Rose. In fact, she stood by Rose. She was steadfast in standing by Rose. Of all the children, she was the one that remained in contact with her. She was the one that visited her. And she was the one who had the most belief, not that her mother was necessarily innocent, but that her mother wasn't a murderer, and that her mother wasn't sexually abusive to Anna Marie. She wanted to believe her mother was guilty, but by 2018, she just couldn't do it anymore. She saw her mother for what she was. She knew how manipulative she was. She knew her mother only cared about her. You could tell, cared about what she wanted, or cared about what she could get from people. Actually, Rose was also engaged to be married from, I think it was the drummer for the band Slade, but that fell apart. Regardless, May is in contact with Tara Louise, and I believe she speaks to some of I believe she speaks to Luciana and also Rosemary Jr., but don't quote me on that. I know she's in contact with Tara and Louise. And she believes for certain that Fred murdered many more women. She's a proponent of that, and they just haven't been found yet. She's very outspoken about her life. She's written at least 2 books. You guys know that. Love Is Always Mom, XOXO. This was 2018. And she and her brother wrote Inside 25 Cromwell Street. Anne Marie also wrote a book about her experiences, guys. She fought trauma for a very long time, but I do know she has no real contact with her younger brothers and sisters. They were not that close anyway. She was probably closer to Heather, but of course Heather was gone now, and she could be a bully. So she suffered probably the most at the hands of Fred and Rose. But she has been open about her experiences, and she has been on several documentaries too, talking about what her family has done, or what her parents, her dad and stepmom did. Tara West was never, like I said, sexually abused by Fred. So she, I don't think, hates Fred as much as she hated Rose. She definitely hated Rose. She took her fair share of the physical abuse. Tara was, like I said, biracial, so she was not abused in that manner. She said, like I said, since Fred thought of his biological daughters as his property and she wasn't his, he didn't touch her. That's what she reiterated. She remains close to both May and Louise. At one point in time, May urged Tara and Louise to go visit Rose. They did. It was not a good experience. So for a little while, Louise stopped speaking to them. There was also something about a photo being sent, guys. So for a little while, they didn't have contact with Louise, but they're all better now. Those 3 still have contact for sure. And sporadically, a handful of times a year, she talks to Stephen. Louise West is still close to May and Tara, of course. And she was the one that started the downfall of Fred and Rose West, if you think about it. It's because she told one of her friends, although I think the other kids had mentioned things to people, just weird things. I think Heather had said something to one of her friends, but regardless, it's because of Louise that the younger children were put into care. It's because of Louise that they found out, that the police found out about Heather being missing and needing to talk to her, and eventually got the search warrant and discovered what had gone on at 25 Cromwell Street. So Louise is a hero, but she felt extraordinarily guilty for ripping the family apart. And she did suffer a little bit in her foster homes. They weren't that nice to her, but she's doing much better now. She has her own family and she's close with her two older sisters. Barry West was the youngest son of Fred and Rose. He suffered a lot too, guys. Barry did. He came forward a few years ago and said that he actually he was there when Rose and Fred killed Heather. This is what makes it seem strange to me, because the older kids do remember seeing Heather at home before they left for school. And ostensibly Rose had walked the other children to school that day. So I'm not sure how Barry was still in the house. He would have been about 7, maybe a little bit younger, but he claims he was in the house the day. He said it was at night too, that Heather was murdered. He said he watched his mother kick her in the head about 5 times and then she stopped moving. I do believe his account, somewhat. I don't think he could forget that. I just don't know exactly when it happened and why he was at home, but regardless. Now, last year, at the age of 40, in 2020, Barry died of a drug overdose. He ostensibly committed suicide, guys. He struggled a lot, and he is gone now. Rose Jr. and Luciana, like I said, I don't really know a lot about them, guys. They were younger, under the age of 12 when they were taken into care. I know they were physically abused by Rose. They obviously have nothing to do with her. I don't know if they speak to May and Tara and Louise. I think there's a tiny bit of contact, but I can't be certain, guys. It is possible that their father is the same client as Tara's, but I can't say for certain. So that's it, guys. That's Fred and Rose West. What are they? Obviously, they're both sadistic murderers. I don't think we need to go into any of the psychology of that. I do want to definitely point out that in this video, I think I've made it pretty clear, guys, that having brain trauma that negatively impacts your frontal lobe will impact your emotion sensors, anger sensors, violence sensors, and your impulse control. So I think this case highlights that, because we know, I think for sure in Fred's case, if you watch the first video, how his family used to describe him and how he was described after he got into the motorcycle accident, as well as Rosie, or Rose, always being described as Dozy Rosie, and the staring periods and things like that. I think this case does show you that brain trauma can affect a person and maybe make them different from what they were. However, they probably had some of these impulses in them anyway, guys, because there's lots of people that suffer from brain injuries and don't end up doing what these two did. I think, you know, they both grew up in semi-abusive homes, although there is a lot of talk that Bill Letts didn't beat Rose. He may have just sexually abused her, although she did watch the trauma of what happened to her mother and everything else. Their family seems to have had more troubles and been even more abusive than what Fred's was. And I mean, Fred didn't get a lot of punishment either because his mother doted on him. But I'm just saying, you know, abuse plays into that. It's nature versus nurture, guys. I think in the case of somebody like Mark Twitchell, you can say it's more nature because he had a good upbringing. But with the case of Rose and Fred, nurture has to come into it too, because of the households they were raised into. That's it, guys. That's basically it. I don't think we have to explain too much more about Fred and Rose and what they are. However, I do have some questions for you. Number one, are there more bodies? Number two, do you believe that Fred killed Mary Baston? Number three, who killed the girls? Was it mostly Fred, mostly Rose, or a combination of both of them? Number four, I would have to say, who do you think killed Charmaine? I asked this before. I'm 100% certain that it was Rose. Do you guys think that Rena had anything to do with Anna or Anne McFall? Who do you think actually did that? I still think it was Fred, what do you guys make of him taking away the bones? What do you think that he did with his trophies? They've never been found. Do you guys think that maybe they could have been in some of those ashes the kids found? Let me know down below. Hopefully this will upload, guys, and I will see you next week with a new video. Hopefully you guys will like this. Hopefully you guys will subscribe, and I hope you guys have a good week. Bye for now.